a senior advocate of Nigeria, Mr. Yemi Kande Johnson. Thank you so much, Mr. Kande Johnson, for coming on tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Where do we start the conversation from? Perhaps we should start from where we started with Mr. Shehu on the issue of the implication of the American election. We saw them also fumbling and faltering in their electoral process. A big lesson for us indeed, isn't it?
Of course it is. And the question you asked the presidential spokesman was as to the performance of American democracy in a time when it has suffered both challenges and successes. And I thought that that was the matter he would respond to. But of course, it's curious to me that his last comments tallied with his first, because his last comment was about, we're not in a military regime, though he sounded like a regimental sergeant major. And his first comment about American democracy is that they're giving us weapons of war. I think that the important thing to say about the American system of government, which we have mimicked, is that it shows the durability of their institutions, that an autocratic president can be contained by the voters, and that the rights of the voters, as contained in the president's speech, that the power of the individual voter is the fundamental of democracy. That is the point which I thought that the presidential spokesman would have taken up. But that exactly is the strength of the American system. You can't say we have a democracy and then say that, and then the rights guaranteed by democracy can be cast aside. You can't say that people who are agitating for a reorganization of the political structure are making noise. That language displays a pathology of thinking, which I think is very dangerous for the sustenance of democracy.
For you, Mr. Kande Johnson, what would you say is perhaps the biggest lesson from Nigeria, since we are mirroring the American system in a lot of ways?
Yes.
What do you think, as it stands right now, is perhaps the biggest lesson for us as a country?
From the American election?
Absolutely.
It's that you must take protest to power. It's that you can march in the streets, you can express your view, you can galvanize your ideas, you can express them vocally, even in the face of terrible violence threatened against you. And that when you do that, that the next step is to organize and mobilize to take, by the measures of the Constitution, political power.
We saw what happened with Mr. Donald Trump saying he's not giving in to the result of that election. And in a lot of ways, is the fact that it's obvious the outcome of the election. But Mr. Biden has been, there is a system that officially makes the result of the election public. But if you look at Mr. Trump, for example, and the outcome of the election, how do you suppose the relationship between Nigeria and America would be going forward?
Well, it's interesting. I listened to a speech by the former President Goodluck Jonathan a few weeks ago, where he spoke about the tremendous pressure brought upon him by the Obama administration, in which Joe Biden was the vice president, sending the Secretary of State to basically lean on him to be sure that the result of the Nigerian elections was put into effect. Now, it's very interesting, therefore, that the presidential spokesman suggests that President Trump, who is an autocrat and in many respects an enemy of democracy, is a better bet for this government than President Biden. It seems to me that what we will see, what I expect to see, especially with the focus that is inevitable in the Biden government on the rights of minorities, of black people, and the very same rights which many people in Nigeria think belong to them on the streets, the right to live, that a man of conscience and character like Joseph Biden would lead a government which would make international human rights a priority, which would make the rights of self-determination of all the nationalities in the variety of countries across the world a priority. And this is important because if America is going to be the beacon for peace and order and democracy in the world, it has to try and promote those in other places and in its own self-interest, because disruption in any part of the world is a danger to the interests of powers like America. So how do you achieve that? In any system, in any government, you cannot rule by force and fear. You have to rule by consent. However that consent is arranged, by constitutional arrangements, by political coalitions. The fact is that if you want to have peace and tranquility, and you want to guarantee the progress of the greatest number of your people, you have to accommodate a variety of interests, and you have to reach agreements, and you have to enlist their consent by these political and social arrangements.
Let's shift attention from the American election to our own local issues here. And I'd like to take you to the issue of the NSAS protesters. So the Federal High Court in Abuja granted the request of the Central Bank of Nigeria to freeze the accounts of 19 young Nigerians and a public affairs company linked to the NSAS protests. From a legal point of view, what are the implications of this?
Well, sorry, since you asked me the legal point of view, I'll respond to that, but it's bad politics. The optics of it is very poor at a time when you're trying to recover from a crisis which has accentuated the massive and unsustainable trust deficit between the Nigerian government and its peoples. It seems that without further explanation, such a step would look like intimidation and political opportunism. I think it's a dangerous step. But as far as the law is concerned, in 2020, the National Assembly passed an amended Banks and Other Financial Institutions law, which, amongst other things, gives the governor of the central bank the power that is exercised with the consent of the court. It's a dangerous power which is subject to irresponsible use, and if it's used for purposes of political oppression, then it becomes increasingly more dangerous. Now you go to a court and you say there is a crime that has been committed, these accounts are involved in that crime. You need to say what that is. You need to give people the opportunity to respond, because anybody who's accused of a crime or criminal activity has a right to defend themselves. Now, what I understand, and I've seen a copy of the ruling, is that the Federal High Court has given an order freezing accounts of individuals for 90 days. The government apparently asked for 180 days, and on the face of it, I would consider this to be an egregious abuse of power. If anybody is accused of a crime, he's entitled to the presumption of innocence. This is in our Constitution, and he's entitled to defend himself at the earliest possible opportunity. Why then would a court grant an ex parte order freezing an account for 90 days? Do you know how they feed themselves? Do you know how they clothe themselves? Do you know whether their mother needs hospital treatment? Even in the most vicious orders of a court, if you freeze accounts, you would allow the capacity of people to have their living. There must be a limit to the power that can be exercised by a party without that party being heard. So it seems to me, without knowing what the facts, without knowing whether there's any crime involved, that even if the most egregious crime is alleged and it can be proved, the opportunity that is denied to people to respond in the shortest possible time to such an allegation is very dangerous. And in the climate in which it has been used, it would seem to me, on the first blush, to be an attempt to intimidate political activity.
The president's spokesperson inferred in that same question, and he said, we are a country governed by law.
Yes.
It was making an inference in the fact that an investigation is on. So in the face of an investigation, yes, that for you isn't right.
Well, an investigation is an inquiry to determine facts. That's what it is. If you have determined those facts conclusively, then those should be in the public domain when you take such a draconian step. If you have not established those facts...
You consider it draconian?
Of course I consider it to be draconian.
But it's captured in the Nigerian law.
Yes. If you look at the history of Nigerian political history, many laws enacted by our governments have been regarded as draconian. It's not about the power to exercise those laws. It's about whether those laws fit in within the regime of our Constitution and whether the extent to which they intrude on individual and personal rights is tolerable. So, of course, the National Assembly can pass a law saying that your house may be seized tomorrow and may be turned into a police station. Would you consider that to be fair? Perhaps not. If that is the situation, then you would consider that to be a draconian exercise of power. Whether a law is draconian or not does not end at the inquiry as to whether it has been properly passed or not. Now, there are many issues that would arise from the exercise of power in this case. I understand that the presidential spokesman is not a lawyer, so maybe he's speaking. I understand he's a journalist, so maybe it's a public perception of it. But we are a nation governed by laws. Amongst those laws is our Constitution. The Constitution of Nigeria, by consent or by prescription, is a series of rights against which every other exercise of political or legal power must be tested, and it can fail. So, if you decided you wanted to take my house without a right for me to be heard, that would be draconian. And I would consider it to be a breach of the Constitution of Nigeria. And the National Assembly cannot pass a law which infringes rights guaranteed by the Constitution.
That act, it was an act of parliament.
It's an act of parliament.
But the thing is, the process of the law also to obtain an ex parte order.
Yes.
That isn't unlawful, is it?
No, but then you then raise another important question.
I'm trying to establish the fact that you do not agree with that position.
I don't
but
agree.
The process of it isn't unlawful, is it?
No. The fact is that you can obtain an ex parte order. This new law says you can obtain an ex parte order. But ex parte order is a procedure. Under the ordinary practice of our courts, you can, in case of urgency and imminent danger, obtain an ex parte order with the condition that such an order is for the shortest possible time, only in cases of extreme urgency. Why? Because it operates against the presumptive right of an individual to be heard before an order that prejudices him is made. So, under the Federal High Court law, for example, under the Federal High Court Civil Procedure rules, you have a right to attack an order that's made against you ex parte within 7 days. And such an order cannot last for 14 days after you have applied to set it aside, because the court must be encouraged to hear you on your rights. How does this fit in with the Federal High Court law and the presumption that you have a right of innocence, and that you have a case, you must respond to the case against you if an order is made freezing your account for 80 or 90 days? And if the government has the conviction to apply to freeze an account of an individual without hearing them for 180 days, then the government must have 100% proof of criminality, and we should see it. It's past investigation. If you come and say, I want to seize your house for 180 days, I'm entitled to say, what is your case against me beyond a reasonable doubt? And that's, I think, he's quite right. It's a question for the Attorney General to answer, and I'm sure that he's considering how he will answer that question.
But in summary, you do not think is a right step to take by the federal government?
I said two things. First of all, I consider it to be, it seems to me to be spiteful. It seems to me to be politically unwise in the context in which we are. As a legal matter, I consider that it is a draconian power which restricts the right of an individual to contain property that belongs to him, and that this cannot be done ex parte except to a very high standard where there's urgency, and that the limitation of law which is provided by all procedure in the Federal High Court is that when such a draconian power is exercised, and an ex parte order is draconian because you are not heard, that you must have the earliest opportunity, and that the court itself must then be the protector of your rights. The court should say, you've made this case, it looks good to me, I'm going to give this order for 3 days. But serve them with this paper tomorrow, and I will hear them. I will make this order, I will continue. I will not grant an order for 90 days. It seems to me to grant an order freezing the account of individuals, especially in the economic circumstances we find ourselves, that it seems to me like an effort to intimidate political opposition.
What if it's hinged, could there be an exception to the rule if it's hinged on issues of national security?
National security, that's a very interesting point. This has not been the case made. But if such a case was made, the court would have to satisfy. You see, the court is to protect the rights of the individual, even against the state. The court will have to make a determination, and the court cannot be prevented from reviewing the national security issue. What is it?
But there's an exception to fundamental rights on the issue of national security.
No, I don't think
it's been debated widely.
Yeah, I don't think that is correct to say there's an exception to national security, because even courts, even countries that exercise the rule of law, who exercise serious restrictions in the case of national security, would have to have some impartial person determine. In England, in America, they have the FISA courts. I want to exercise a draconian power in the interest of national security. It's a legitimate interest, but I must satisfy someone. I cannot determine national security by myself and exercise it. And this brings us back to the bigger question. Who is the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria? Is the Central Bank of Nigeria the national security agency? Where does the Central Bank of Nigeria get the temerity to purport that it is exercising a power for national security? That's not the job or business of the Central Bank of Nigeria.
All right. Let's take a breather.
We need one, clearly.
I mean, I'm loving it because I'm interested in law too. So we're learning some things here.
Yes.
We'll take another break, everyone. And when we return, the EndSARS protest and its effects still lingers. We'll talk more on the approach of government in the handling of the situation at hand. Join us again, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us. Let's get back to the conversation with the senior lawyer, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, Yemi Kande Johnson. Thank you indeed for your thoughts tonight. Perhaps let's finalize on the issue of the EndSARS and the freezing of accounts of those 19 individuals and their company. So let me get your final thought on the fact that you are telling us that on no account can the state freeze the account of any citizen, isn't it?
No, I haven't said so. If your account is involved in criminal behavior, of course an order can be sought. There are a variety of measures. The point that I emphasize is that these powers cannot be exercised without proper judicial oversight, without a high burden of legal proof, and without the earliest opportunity for a person affected to dislodge the presumption that has been relied upon to obtain that order. That is the point.
So, I mean, you've been following the events. Yes. You live around that corridor.
Yes.
And you saw what happened.
Yes.
Let me get to your reaction.
Yes.
As a Nigerian, the ongoings about the EndSARS protest and the agitation and the way the federal government has handled it. What's your reaction to the manner and approach the federal government has handled the situation?
Well, the first question, of course, is that these protests, the violence that followed them is a separate issue, and a proper inquiry should be made into acts of brigandage, looting, arson, which were committed by people who I do not understand to have been the protesters. And I think, with regard to the protests, that it was a good day for Nigeria that a wide section of its youth, who make up more than 6% of its population, were activated to hold their government accountable in a political way. What are they asking for? That the right to life, which is the fundamental obligation of their government to them, should be guaranteed. They promised it. Why wouldn't they give it? That there must be accountability in the administration of government. That government must not act like as if it is a colonial power, but government must act like as if it exists in the interest of the people. These are simple questions to be asked. I mean, the fact is, these are questions that the National Assembly should be asking the government every day. And if they don't do so, the fact is that the National Assembly is merely an agent for the people, and there is no limitation on the opportunity of people to interrogate their government. You don't have to go to the National Assembly. You can interrogate your government in a program like this. Now, as to the response of the government, there are a number of inquiries going on. There is more than strong anecdotal evidence that many of the interruptions with violence of these protests were engendered by what looked like official means. The processes by which the disruption was made seem to me to have been political in its own response. And this is not surprising. The history of Nigeria shows two things. One is that violence is the way that Nigerians negotiate with the state, and the state expects to be negotiated with violence. If you look at Boko Haram, if you look at the MEND process, if you look at the history of Nigeria, governments have only responded to disruption. And how you describe a political event depends on your perspective. In the case of government, how it is described is very often the function of propaganda. So, for example, the 1924 Aba women's protests about taxation is described by the British colonialists as a riot. In 1949, when Funmilayo Ransome Kuti led a protest about tax in another woman against the Egba United government and against the British, they called it a riot. When Alimoto Kwelewora protested in Lagos, they called it a riot. So this is normal. So our governments traditionally like to set the parameters for their response by characterizing political events as disruptive and unlawful. And because they are not very much wont to responding to orderly and systematic political discussion, it seems that the history of Nigeria teaches that even our current Nigerian Republic responds to violence. So someone asked me the other day, why is the government negotiating with Boko Haram? Because after they have inflicted violence on the Nigerian state needs to reorder its priorities. And the question will then be asked, if hungry and desperate people break the law, which is wrong, how do you deal with them? It's not just a legal matter, it's a political matter. And the government has to have its own idea as to how to resolve the troubling aspects of our social and economic organization, our political organization. The Constitution is not a magic document. It is a political and social contract. Now, the government, when you ask the presidential spokesman about Constitution, about the order in the country, he says, let them go to the House Assembly. I think that the dismissive attitude underlies his lack of understanding of the role of leadership in a political situation, a political society, in a democracy. I would have expected him to say, we have our own views as to how to resolve the crisis of structure and the crisis of democracy and security in the country, and we will come up with our own proposal, not say, let them take it to wherever they want to go to. That was a very unfortunate response from him, I thought.
At this moment, there are a lot of things that are happening. Do you see that agitation by these young Nigerians as a one-off, or a consciousness that will dovetail into some other political activities in the nearest future?
You know, it's an awakening. Why do I say so? Because politics in Nigeria, from the colonial times until this time, was invented by the youth. Awolowo and Nahoro, all these people were very young people. And indeed, General Buhari was in his 30s when he became head of state. General Gowon was in his early 20s. The fact is that political agitation and political realignment has most often in Nigeria, throughout its history, come from the activity of the youth. Now, the youth is not a repository of all knowledge, but youth is not a desert of knowledge either. And the mistake that would be made is to think that an activated populace who understand their rights and understand that they must mobilize and organize to achieve them is going to be silenced by another thing that Nigerian history teaches. And if you read books on colonial violence in Nigeria, is that acts of violence coalesce political movements. They consolidate them. They cause them to respond and they cause them to metastasize into a way that will continue to permeate the body politic. If they can't do it in one way, they'll do it in another way. But the fact is that our history shows that political intimidation and government-sponsored violence, right from the time of the colonial era, has never been able to stop legitimate political agitation.
Have few seconds left on the program, and I'd like to check you up on two issues. One is some of the young Nigerians, one of them was named in that lawsuit by the CBN, and they pulled out the young representative on the panel in Lagos had pulled out, and therefore the panel head said they wouldn't continue sitting. What do you think is the implication of that?
Well, the implication of that is that whoever took the decision to freeze those accounts did not consider intelligently or carefully their responsibility to the political situation and the ongoing attempts to diffuse and resolve it. If there's 100,000, if there's 100 million naira in somebody's account, and you have a case against them, it's stolen money forever, you can seize it for sure. But then when you target individuals who have been involved in a type of political protest, it's the most difficult thing to do. It must be done with care, responsibility, and retrospection. What is it I wish to achieve by freezing this account? The central bank governor, who is now obviously the chief of police in the National Intelligence Agency, has decided that this is a good thing for him to do, to exercise the powers which belong to him, not the president, to exercise the powers that belong to him for the purpose of the political advantage of the government. He thinks it's politically advantageous, obviously, to seize these accounts. I would regard that as some form of political folly. And perhaps when a government decides to take action, the presidential spokesman is quite right. The government is one. There's one president. The buck stops on his desk. Therefore, every aspect of the government needs to be singing from the same hymn book as to the response to situations which are disruptive to the calm regulation of the body politic. So if it is in the interest of the president, and he has stated so, to have these tribunals to resolve and to diffuse a legitimate appeal for rights in Nigeria, then I would have thought that someone might have sent a memo to the central bank governor that this step is quite unhelpful.
Let's close on this note as we wrap up now. The Southwest leaders today met, and they made a lot of recommendations. Part of which is that the federal government should consider the recommendations from the confabs of the past. How urgently do you think the federal government should do this, and in what ways do you think they can handle it? If you can touch on that in 30 seconds.
Any government that is responsible and efficient needs to have in mind the multiple occasions and issues that it would have to confront. It's a national security problem. It's an economic problem. It's a political problem. So it would shock me very much if the federal government did not have a settled view on reports which it has commissioned over the years, and to determine for itself how those ideas can be implemented to resolving many of the crises in the country. The crisis of security, some people think it will be resolved by having state police. Many of the crises in economic development and production of jobs, people think would be resolved by delegating economic regulation. So, for example, why do I need to have to go to Abuja to register a company to do business in Lagos? Why do I need to go to Abuja to intercede with my tax authority? These are issues of structure and political organization. The purpose of these arrangements is efficiency and the greatest progressive development of the nation. If a government has not thought about the best way to resolve those problems, then I sigh with exasperation.
Mr. Yemi Kandu-Johnson, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, thank you so much indeed for your thought tonight, and we appreciate for coming tonight.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's our show for today, everyone. Many thanks for watching. I'm Sean Okimale. Bye-bye.